Welcome, I'm Barry Kibrick, and my guest today is the acclaimed author and psychologist Dennis Palumbo. With his latest book, Head Wounds, the fifth installment of the much-admired Daniel Rinaldi Mysteries, Dennis gets his most personal, and in turn, we get to benefit from his insightful wisdom that transcends the fictional. Dennis, you know, you're almost getting to the point where you're setting the record. I just love having you on my show, not just for your books, fiction and nonfiction, but just for your wisdom and insight. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Barry, for having me on so many times. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to start off with your words. Miles Davis saved my life. And it's a funny thing you mention it because I had a rock book I did. And they told me that Miles Davis actually played with his back to the audience oftentimes. And I was curious if you knew that and what made you start this book with that particular words. I can tell later on, but what made you start it that way?
Well, first of all, I had heard that Miles Davis often played with his back to the audience, which is kind of strange. I start the book with Miles Davis saved my life because, as you see in that chapter, when my hero, Daniel Rinaldi, is listening to Miles Davis on his seminal album. And when he goes to raise the volume because of his favorite song coming on, by bending down, it ends up preventing something terrible from happening to Daniel Rinaldi. And so that's why Miles Davis saved his life.
But there's more to it in your books, Dennis, because I know you were a film writer, and right. My favorite year is one of my favorite movies, but it's almost as if, whether it's Miles Davis, Nina Simone, it's as if you're scoring the book as well.
I often think that I am, because my hero, psychologist Daniel Rinaldi, is a big jazz fan. I make reference to my favorite jazz performers. And as a result, it is a little bit like the soundtrack to the book. When he goes to his favorite bar, where his best friend, Noah Fry, works, there's always jazz playing. And I like to talk about the players, whether it's Ornette Coleman or Mariana Evans. I just love jazz, and I wanted my character to do so as well.
And there's an element of a jazziness to the character. I know that sounds funny, but there's that. First of all, as a psychologist, he's one of the toughest guys there is. And in fact, you can give a little blurb about the story because we're going to talk about it so much as reality.
Yeah.
So give a little blurb, but he is one of the toughest guys there is.
It's funny. Kirkus Reviews once said that he was Jack Reacher with a psychology degree. And what I did with Daniel Rinaldi, he is a psychologist and trauma expert who consults with the Pittsburgh police. And like me, he was born of blue-collar parents. He grew up in Pittsburgh. He graduated from Pitt. But unlike me, his father was a beat cop who used to take him around to play, to box at the Pan Am Games and the Golden Gloves. He was an amateur boxer as a teenager. And one of the reasons I did this is I wanted to push back against the image that a psychologist is necessarily what used to be called a soft male. And so he's really empathic, he's very sensitive, but he's quick to anger. And his being an amateur boxer with a father who always disapproved of him and thought he never did well enough in the ring sets up that part of him that's stubborn, that takes offense quickly. You know, he has a lot of flaws. And so...
Oh, you know, I have to interrupt you.
Yeah?
Because the flaws, and I know what you're talking about, they're my favorite parts of Rinaldi.
That's everybody's favorite parts of Rinaldi, is he's so stubborn, he's so bullheaded. Particularly, one of the things that I enjoy is he's a real maverick among his clinical colleagues. He does things as a psychologist that just are on the border of having his license yanked. But that's what I like about him. He gets to be the sort of maverick clinician that myself and my colleagues can never be.
Now, I know in some of the other books in the series, there's 5 of them, we've dealt with this a little bit, but in this one, guilt in particular seems to really almost be the primal emotion that not only Rinaldi, but everyone is dealing with. There's an element of guilt, and even in the book you say you're even going through your own self-psychoanalysis with this guilt. When you say, my involvement in some recent high-profile cases was my way of working out my own survival guilt. Guilt is pervasive.
Well, Daniel Rinaldi had an intensely traumatic experience. 12 years ago, which happens before the first book begins, he and his wife were mugged coming out of a restaurant, and it went sideways. Gunshots came out. His wife was killed at the scene. He was very seriously injured, but he survived. And as a result, he struggled with survivor guilt for years and years, and still has much lingering survivor guilt. On the other side, that was the origin of his mission to treat people traumatized by violence, to treat people who have many of the symptoms we associate with PTSD. And one of the things that I like about the new book is he finally comes face to face with the reality of what happened to his wife. What seemed like a simple mugging actually wasn't. And all of his guilt that he thought he had put away a long time ago, after years of his own personal therapy, starts to come up again. He starts reliving aspects of his marriage, the good and the bad, and revisits all of those experiences again.
And also, because of who he's dealing with, and I have to say right off the bat that this is one of the most sadistic characters in literature, this Sebastian that he has to deal with. And I mean, go with Silence of the Lambs, go with anyone you want. I have yet to read of a serial killer this sadistic. And I joked with you before, I said, I didn't want to talk about it on this beforehand, but I'm going to talk about it now. And that was, I was almost worried about you. How you could write something like this made me nervous.
Well, good, it made me nervous writing it. I used to scare myself while I was writing it because I wanted 2 things. First of all, in all the previous books, they're thrillers, but they're also whodunits. You don't really know who the bad guy is, really, until the end. I did something different with Head Wounds. I let us, the reader, know right up front, this is the bad guy. His name is Sebastian Maddox. He's an obsessive, he's a computer genius, and he struggles with a delusion called erotomania. And it begins a cat and mouse game between Daniel Rinaldi and Sebastian Maddox. And I just kept telling myself, what would be the scariest thing that happened to me? If I were Sebastian Maddox, what's the worst thing I would do? And I think because I'm a therapist as well as an author, most of the time I have to suppress those dark, nightmarish feelings. I get to put them out in this book. I mean, I wanted to create the most harrowing situations I could think of.
Well, you succeed, and it does so to the reader as well. There's no... But what's interesting, you play with other elements. The city itself of Pittsburgh, it plays a major role in the story. From its sights, even its smells, even the triangulation of the 3 rivers that go by it. Pittsburgh has a role in this novel that is as strong as some of the characters.
Well, I think of the city of Pittsburgh as a character. I've thought of it as a character throughout all 5 novels because if from nothing else, it is such a vibrant and rich environment, palette in which to tell the story. But also Pittsburgh is undergoing so many changes. When I was in college, I worked my way through Pitt working at J&L Steel Mill on 2nd Avenue in Pittsburgh. Those steel mills are all gone. It's gone from being an industrial powerhouse to a kind of white-collar, state-of-the-art, technological and medical center for most of the country. I mean, all the robotics that we hear about, they're being done at Pitt and Carnegie Mellon. And so Pittsburgh has this kind of uneasy relationship with itself. Some of the most traditional, historic neighborhoods have become so gentrified that the people who's lived there for generations can't afford to live there anymore.
But you use a great line in the book. I want to quote it exactly, because you say, as a therapist, now this is Rinaldi speaking, but
Sure.
You're the therapist as well. As a therapist, I was quite familiar with the idea of the past invading the present. And that's what we're seeing here.
Right.
And we can't yet tell, is this a good thing? It seems like it's a good thing because gentrification is good, but yet, like you say, there's the pride and prejudice of the old neighborhoods, and it's a very interesting blend. And as a therapist, you seem extremely aware of this past invading, because what is it that you deal with when you deal with your patients? It's usually their past invading their present.
That's right. As psychologist Alice Miller said, our childhood is the air we breathe. And so most of my patients, their childhood dynamics, what happened in their family of origin, plays a very, very big part in their treatment. Well, Pittsburgh as a city represents both the past and the present. So you'll see some brand new sparkling building right down at the point where it's something, a new bank building or a new technological center. I mean, Amazon's thinking seriously of headquartering in Pittsburgh. It hasn't made up its mind yet, but it may. And right next to it is cobblestone streets with the streetcar tracks that when the streetcars ran 50, 60, 70 years ago. And those cobblestone streets are still there.
You have a character, I like to call him the comic relief, named Polk. And it's not that he's funny, it's what he does that somehow, actually, isn't that what humor is all about? Yeah. It's never trying to be funny, it's what you do that just happens to be. And he says to Daniel Rinaldi, nothing in this effed up world, you don't use it so politely, makes any sense. If you ain't learned that by now, you ain't learned nothing. And there's something, again, as a real therapist, I believe that's what you must have realized. You have to realize that after a while.
Of course. One of the things that makes anyone a more mature person is the realization of their limits of their knowledge. As the philosopher once said, whose name just escapes me, there's no such thing as certainty. There are only people who are certain. And what I like about Sergeant Polk, who is a homicide detective who has a very, very uneasy relationship with Daniel Rinaldi, not a big fan of his being a consultant. And so he tends to be a kind of, he's able to sort of puncture the intellectual pretensions that sometimes a therapist seems to exhibit. He has no patience for all that book learning. He doesn't understand psychology at all. To him, it's just like people who go into therapy are just nut jobs. And so he's a good foil for Daniel Rinaldi.
A sixth sense. Rinaldi has it in spades. I was curious about what you in real life thought about the sixth sense. That sense that we do possess, I believe, that is almost a combination of foresight, as if we could see what's about to happen, and yet it can't be, because it also has to be a combination of something from the past. But yet we use this term, and I was curious as a therapist what you really thought of it.
One of the things that I like about Daniel Rinaldi is he trusts his gut. He trusts his intuition about someone. Now, in my books, as any longtime reader knows, half the time his intuition is wrong. It wouldn't be any fun for the reader, and certainly none for me, if it was correct. He'll have a sense of someone or have an idea about someone's motives, and he's way off base. But oftentimes he isn't. And the problem is his intuition gets him in trouble because there's no actual empirical evidence to support something he may think or worry about.
The thing that comes through here that I think really, if everyone reads and reflects upon, will benefit them, is because there are so many harrowing situations, not only that Rinaldi finds himself in, but that is existing, but I'm mentioning Rinaldi in particular here, is that in every case, he knows how important it is to calm himself over and over throughout the book. No matter what the situation is, Rinaldi has the ability to learn to calm himself. That is, I bet you if you could teach every one of your patients to be able to calm themselves, would that not be as grand of a success as you could hope for?
Yes, I think I'd start with trying to calm myself and then maybe work with my patients. But that is something that I use thematically throughout the book. One of the things that I've always thought about thrillers is the heroes often seem too untouched and untroubled by the traumatic events in which they're involved. And I wanted to make it very clear to the reader that my hero is barely hanging on by a thread during this cat and mouse game with Sebastian, and that he actually has to calm himself. He has to tell himself not to be led by this bad guy down the road of madness, which is where Sebastian wants to take him. As Maddox says at some point, I want to wring every drop of pain out of your heart before I end you. And so Daniel's job in this novel is to try to keep himself together long enough to be able to match wits with this guy.
Fear. Obviously, it's used in this book to the nth degree. I want to read these words, though, by you. Well, it is by you, even though it's said by Daniel. Fear, I never trusted a colleague who wasn't afraid. Fear, that thing we can nor should ever lose, but must always keep it at bay when we are not actually in danger. That again seems to be something that in our society, whether it's through the media, whether it's through gosh knows what anymore, we seem to be almost overwhelmed by fear because it's pumped so much into it and so much into us. And yet the truth is, when there is no real fear, that causes some of the most psychological problems when you're fearing things that are in the abstract rather than in the reality.
Well, that's what makes navigating fear so difficult, is knowing that you need enough of it to be realistic about how the world works and the things that happen in the world. And yet when you're bombarded 24/7 by the media's images of the chaos and violence in the world, there's a real tendency to overinflate the amount of fear you should have during every waking moment. And I think that that's something that everyone should try to be on guard for. And every time there's like a pandemic or a natural disaster or, a horrible mass shooting somewhere, this spike in our fear, in our anxiety, in our sense of, oh my gosh, everything's unraveling, everything's falling apart. It takes so much focus to keep that fear at bay, to manage it, to navigate it. And one of the things that I try to do in Head Wounds is show how when fear is used to manipulate people, the way Sebastian Maddox uses it, and he does not only the horrific things that you've mentioned, he does very subtle things. You'll go to open up your computer laptop and Daniel will find that his screensaver is down and there's an 8x10 shot of Sebastian Maddox saying, I think I take a very nice picture, don't you? And it's a terrifying moment in the book, but nothing's really happened. But it's ratcheting up the anxiety that Daniel Rinaldi fears because he can be gotten to so easily.
Now, confidence is almost the best combatant, because again, we're never going to lose fear. We don't want that even.
No,
we need fear for survival, right?
Right.
But confidence is one of those things that helps you keep it at bay. And yet you say a very funny line in here. Confidence is good up to a point because it can dull the senses.
That's right. The key to, I think, trying to navigate the world is this uneasy balance between anxiety and a sense of relative confidence, what I call cautious optimism that the day is going to be okay. And one of the things that my mentor, Robert Stollerow, talks about is that when people are traumatized by violence, one of the things it does to them is it undercuts their ability to have any assumptions about the ordinariness of life.
When that happens, you say this line, and I've believed in this so often. Sometimes the body has its own wisdom. And I think oftentimes we're spending so much time in our head that we forget what the body can tell us. And the body, its cellular structure has been around so much longer than our frontal lobe. It does literally have wisdom, and we must heed it. And yet, we're so not used to. We never say it's body over mind. We always say it's mind over body. But the truth is, so oftentimes, if you can listen to your body, you can fix your mind.
Well, I always think of something Emerson said, which is first be a good animal. And I think that if you look at how an animal responds, if it's hungry, it eats. If it's sleepy, it sleeps. If it's angry, it growls. And then it doesn't, after growling, go, gee, I wonder if I hurt the other person's feelings by growling. I wonder if there was a real sufficient reason for me to growl. Sure, she stepped on my tail, but maybe she didn't mean it. After all, I don't want to make assumptions about what her motives are. Cats don't do any of that. Dogs don't do any of that. They just respond. They listen to their body, and in the next moment, that emotion is gone. And so, while consciousness for humans is a wonderful tool for progress and for advancement, it also, as the Buddhists say, it's a wonderful servant but a terrible master. And I think the thinking mind, when it seems to try to talk itself out of how the body feels. I mean, I know this one very well. When I'm sick, I tell myself, I'm not that sick. I can go to work. The reality is my body's going, no, lay down, drink some tea, take the day off. But I have ideas about how I'm supposed to be in the world, how I'm supposed to perform, what my obligations and responsibilities are. And that always trumps the fact that what my body wants to do is relax and get better.
And that's why you've got to listen to that body, because it's the own, and I'm telling you, it works if you can do it. And it's I don't know, it's just a beautiful thing when it happens. But there's a character in here I want to just briefly talk about, because I think it reflects what so many people have to deal with. His name is Beegler or Beigler. I don't know how you pronounce it. How do you pronounce it?
I always pronounce it Beegler.
Beegler, okay. They may not seem so smart, but they can be damn savvy with great survival instincts. Pricks like him often end up running things. I cannot tell you how often I have experienced that people who are in charge are oftentimes just that. They're savvy, but they're not good, they're not kind, they're not even doing their job correctly, yet they get there. And there is, you talk about you being between grief and rage in the book. That puts me between just rage. I don't even have grief over it. I just have rage over it.
Well, just to put it in context for the viewers, Lieutenant Beegler is the head of robbery homicide in the Pittsburgh Police Department, and he hates Daniel Rinaldi for any number of reasons, but primarily he just hates him and resents him because his involvement in some high-profile cases has ended up getting Daniel Rinaldi some national press. So he's become like a go-to expert on CNN. And so for Beegler, he is just a thorn in his side. But we've come to see over the 5 books that he's very officious, he has no empathy, and he doesn't have very good skills. He's a bureaucrat. And he's so savvy politically that he keeps rising in the police department without any of the skill set necessary to do his job. He's a little bit like the Peter Principle.
Well,
Which I'm old enough to remember what that is, where he rose way above his level of competence.
Well, I'm not going to end on that note. I'm going to end on this one. And life, as it always does, went on.
Yes.
Dennis, always a pleasure, my friend.
Thank you so much, Barry. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. Now, before Dennis leaves, I'd like to leave you with these few more words from Head Wounds. And by the way, they're spoken by Noah, one of his patients. That's the trouble with people, Danny. I mean, nobody's happy. And you know why? 'Cause everybody thinks the party's happening somewhere else. I'm Barry Kibrick, between life's ups and downs. If you want to stay happy, know that it's not somewhere else, but that it's here and now. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Barry.
My pleasure.
To connect with Barry, like him on Facebook and follow him on Twitter @Barry Kibrick. And to contact Barry directly, view past episodes of Between the Lines, and read his weekly blog, visit us at barrykibrick.com.